The Executive Board of Tunisia's Central Bank is calling for drastic economic reforms to help the country overcome its current multiple crises. As CGTN's Adnen Chaouachi now reports, the North African country has been struggling with a crippling economic crisis, and that includes sky-high inflation, high unemployment, and a surge in COVID-19 infections.
The Central Bank of Tunisia urged the government, as well as all political and social actors in the country, to preserve political stability and spur its economic recovery. Experts maintain that several years of political turmoil and social unrest have slowed down economic reforms and growth in the North African state.
The central bank says that there are too many economic objectives and much-needed reforms, but which have been hampered by obstacles created by political parties, national organizations, and the Tunisian society in general. Some officials who have benefited from this crisis over the last decade want the situation to remain unchanged, the state to remain weak, and its institutions to be absent, so that they can continue to profit at the expense of the national economy.
The Apex Bank also called for the need to restore the confidence of international banking and financial institutions and foreign donors in the Tunisian economy.
The problem in Tunisia is that there's a crisis within the crisis management unit. The president, the parliament speaker, and the prime minister could not agree on one economic strategy for the state. At the same time, the IMF, the World Bank, and all international donors need one Tunisian interlocutor and one voice, with a clear vision for the economic woes and its solutions.
President Kais Saied sacked Tunisia's finance minister and appointed Siham Bourdiri as acting Minister of Finance, Economy and Investment in a bid to increase state revenues and accelerate the pace of structural economic reform. The new appointee is an expert in fiscal policy and reform.
Some Tunisians have hundreds of millions in foreign banks. We don't want any economic actor to be treated unjustly, but we are looking for fiscal justice for everyone. It's unacceptable that some people pay taxes while others don't. The individuals who tend to evade taxes in Europe are considered persona non grata by the state and the people.
According to the latest monetary and financial indicators published by the Central Bank, cumulative labor income increased by 32% at the end of July 2021. In addition, tourism revenues stood at $390 million at the end of July 2021, posting a 12% decrease compared to the same period last year. Analysts assert that the current political crisis remains alarming after the dismissal of the Prime Minister and his government by the Tunisian president. The absence of a clear roadmap has exacerbated the economic situation, which is battered by the COVID-19 pandemic. Adnen Chaouachi, CGTN, Tunis.
All right, and so where does that leave Tunisia? What are the options on the table for solving both the country's economic and political crises? Let's explore the options with Fadhel Kaboub. He's an associate professor of economics at Denison University. He's joining us live on the program tonight. Thank you for your time this evening, sir. So cutting energy subsidies and lowering the public wage bill, which is equivalent to around 17% of GDP last year, according to the IMF. These are key priorities for the country, but why is it so difficult to do this?
Well, thank you for having me, and thanks for the question. It's difficult because these are social priorities. There's mass unemployment in Tunisia, there's inflation, there's a massive external debt, and all of these things are interlinked. So reducing the wage bill in and of itself, reducing the subsidies for food and fuel in of themselves will not address the root causes of this problem, which is the external debt. And when you look at Tunisia's external debt, its origins are fundamentally structural. They're related to food imports, they're related to energy imports, and they're related to a structural industrialization problem whereby Tunisia exports low value-added content and imports high value-added content. So you put these three things together and you end up with a structural trade deficit that weakens the value of the Tunisian dinar. And as a result, everything Tunisia imports the next day, whether it's food or medicine or fuel, is imported at a higher cost, which means we import that inflation. And the only way to mitigate the sources of inflation is not to cut the subsidies, but rather build productive capacity in food security and renewable energy security and a different kind of industrialization that focuses on value-added content. So all of these temporary solutions that are being debated currently with the IMF and within the Tunisian Central Bank, within the Tunisian government, are really band-aid solutions that are not going to address the fundamental root causes of this problem. And removing the subsidies is just going to make it even more painful for the most vulnerable people in Tunisia and not really address the roots of the problem.
But ultimately, I mean, at the end of the day, these subsidies can't go on forever, right? Because as you point out, the currency is being devalued, the productivity of the population as a whole, that's also not essentially rising at the pace that it needs to do. So at some point, we're essentially going to run off the cliff, and these subsidies will either have to be drastically reduced or cut entirely.
The subsidies should be shifted to building the productive capacities in the areas that will actually mitigate the source of inflation. That is renewable energy, that is food security, cracking down on corruption, cracking down on smuggling, cracking down on abusive price-setting behavior, cracking down on the individuals and companies that have exclusive import licenses that actually control these markets. This is where the roots of the problems are. And some of this is happening in the last few days on a small scale, but this has to be a systematic kind of long-term strategic vision focusing on the roots of the problem. I'll give you one example. And this is true for other central banks around the world, not just Tunisia. When we face inflation, central banks raise interest rates and try to slow down economic activity, essentially, by raising interest rates. When the actual source of inflation, say in a country like Tunisia, is wheat imports and fuel imports. So what does raising the interest rate in Tunisia, what is it going to do to convince OPEC to lower fuel prices, or to convince the Ukraine or Russia or Australia to lower wheat prices? These are prices that are determined in global markets way outside the jurisdiction of the central bank. And as a result, these tools that central bankers use are really not addressing the roots of the problem. They're just trying to kind of introduce band-aids and wiggle around the edges without really addressing anything structural.
The UGTT Labour Union has called for the speedy appointment of a small cabinet led by an experienced premier. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that does happen. What are the top 3 or 5 things that they must solve this year?
Absolutely. So the top 3 issues that any administration must address, and the 10 administrations that took office in the last 10 years since the uprisings of 2011 should have addressed, are the following. Prioritizing food security, that is investing in domestic food sovereignty. Number 2, prioritizing renewable energy production. And that is, you can't really run an economy without food, without energy. These are the foundations of the economy. Number 3, cracking down on corruption networks that have this abusive market share, that have this abusive price-setting behavior, cross-border trafficking networks. And then finally, having a long-term strategic vision for Tunisia's industrial policy. That is moving away from the race to the bottom, whereby we focus on any kind of assembly line type of manufacturing, any kind of foreign direct investment, and rather prioritizing high value added content of industrialization, focusing on strategic areas of resilience, such as health and education and infrastructure. These has to be the top priority of any administration, regardless of their political affiliation, because this is how you build a resilient and sustainable economy.
All right, one last question for you, sir. So where does this leave Tunisia's talks on a new program with the IMF? If there is no deal with the IMF, might we perhaps see Tunisia go down the same route that Lebanon has gone down?
Well, unfortunately, I've said this before, and I repeat it again today. This is really the result of decades of austerity, of decades of neglect in investing in key areas of resilience for the economy. And if we rely on external funds, external loans from the IMF and other international lenders, then you're going to have to accept their conditions. And their conditionalities are extremely painful. And the thing is, if they were painful and they would work, we'll say, okay, this is a necessary pain. The problem is that these are painful and dangerous, and they don't even work in the short term or in the long term. These are simply band-aid solutions. The infection is still there. You can't fix it with a band-aid. You can't fix it with a short-term loan from the IMF.
All right, we'll leave it there for the time being. Fadhel Kaboub, Associate Professor of Economics at Denison University. Thank you very much for your time this evening.